My name is Sujit Chouhdry. I'm a Canadian. I currently am a professor at the NYU School of Law. And at NYU, I founded and I direct the Center for Constitutional Transitions, which is a knowledge partner for constitution building processes in the field. And what we do is that we mobilize existing knowledge in support of field missions that are attached to constitutional transitional processes. We also convene international expert networks with policy partners to basically create new knowledge where it's needed in the field to serve as the basis for technical advice. It really bridges policy work and academe. So we do very serious academic work. We're producing important scholarship. We're training a whole generation of students who will go on to work in the field. And that mentoring and training role is very important for me. But we're also working very closely with policy partners and advisors in the field. I often get into the field myself. And so the work we do has real impact, and we add value. So I think that the interesting thing about group rights is that they're not always what we think they are. And so if you were to ask someone what a group right is, they might say, well, a group right is a right held by a certain collectivity, a national minority, an indigenous group, a religious minority. It's a right held by that group collectively, not by individuals in that group. It's exercised by that group collectively through its leadership or its governing institutions. And the point of the right is to give the group power over questions that are integral to its cultural survival. So like family law for religious groups or questions of language policy for national minorities. And part of what I'm trying to argue is that that's actually not always, in fact, in many cases, not the way in which the term group rights are deployed in actual politics and political practice. That really what motivates groups to mobilize around claims of group rights is the search for economic and political power. And it's often the case that ethnic groups face barriers to their full participation in markets and politics. And what they want is a system of electoral representation, political party representation, legislative rules, and rules governing the composition of the political executive that give them a say. And so so culture is part of the picture, but it's not nearly the only thing, or actually in many cases, not the most important thing. So a lot of political theorists who write about group rights, and there's a lot of great Canadians who actually are at the center of this way of thinking about group rights. What they've done in a way is sort of generalize out from a certain reading of what's happened in Quebec and Canada. And so in Quebec and Canada, as you know, for several decades, we have dealt with the kind of the politics of recognition and the claims that the Canadian Constitution ought to recognize Quebec's distinctiveness or specificity, and that there ought to be space within our federal institutions and also within our Constitution to recognize the fact of Quebec's distinctiveness. And so what a lot of folks have done is to generalize out from Canada to basically say, well, this is actually what group rights are about everywhere, that they're about claims for cultural survival and distinctiveness. And what I kind of argue is that that's certainly true in some contexts. You can't deny the identity-based aspects of mobilization for group rights, but in many cases, what motivates groups to make claims for group rights is economic power and political power. So I'll give you a great example. It's from India, right? So India, in the post-independence period, redrew almost all of its state boundaries to align with the boundaries of linguistic groups. And so the states in India are remarkably linguistically homogeneous, and there's a clear linguistic majority in most states. What drove that process of political reconfiguration was economic competition, in particular competition over public sector employment. Because what an official language does is it not only distributes cultural power and recognition, but it also determines who can work for the state. And in a post-colonial, developing society, that's a very precious commodity. And so when groups mobilized around official language status, and then when they, in states that were linguistically pluralistic, to basically redraw state lines so that there was a clear majority for their language group, it was designed basically to get access to public sector employment and through it to political power. You know, when we think about group rights and why it matters practically to understand what they are, there's two levels at which we have to think about this. The first is when we write constitutions, or when we support other countries in drafting their constitutions, when there are groups at the table that make demands for group rights, we have to understand exactly what is at the basis of those claims so that we can advise them properly. There's a second order issue that arises, which is that every constitution that's adopted now will have a Bill of Rights that grant rights to individuals. So the right to freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of religion, due process, the right to non-discrimination. And so if those constitutions also have group rights, there is this problem that might arise where you have these conflicting logics, right? So on the one hand, the group right institutionalizes ethnic difference, it grants people political status on the basis of their ethnicity, they might empower collectivities. Individual rights recognize citizens as individuals who are bearers of individual rights, who have a direct connection with the state, irrespective of their group identity. And there might be cases where kind of the exercise of a group right conflicts with an exercise of an individual right. So for example, an official language policy that, let's say, prohibits commercial signage in a language would contravene the right to freedom of expression. Rules that restrict land holding by migrants from other parts of the country would restrict the right to interstate or internal mobility. And so these are the types of clashes that arise between individual and group rights. What I think we also have to recognize is that if we recognize that group rights are rooted not just in culture, but actually often in material considerations, economic and political power, I think there's two things that come from that. The first is that we have to be skeptical when public policies are justified as being rooted in group rights in order to protect cultural distinctiveness. So I'll give you an example. In Nigeria, there is a policy whereby individuals indigenous to a state are given preference in public sector employment and public housing. And individuals need a certificate of indigeneity that identifies them as being members of an ethnic group that is regarded as being indigenous to that state in order to get access to these services and also to employment. Now, the argument for that is, on its face, to protect cultural survival and to protect a state's character. But really, it's about insiders keeping outsiders out. And it's about distributing the spoils of power. And so I think one thing we should always be careful about is to be skeptical when claims are made in the name of cultural difference. That's an abuse of diversity. It's an abuse of pluralism. So that's the first point. The second point is that there's often ways that we can think about protecting diversity and allowing its expression in politics without necessarily engaging in discrimination. So if I can give you a concrete example, in Northern Ireland there is a rule that allocates seats in the cabinet in the Northern Ireland government on the basis of political party standing in the assembly. In practice, what that does is to ensure that there are a mixture of Protestants and Catholics in the cabinet, because at this current time, Northern Irish politics is organized on the basis of these competing national identities. But the rule does not preclude a different type of scenario where you have, let's say, a politics of class emerging. And you have parties that are divided not on the basis of nationality, but on the basis of economic policy. And that kind of a cabinet rule would be flexible enough to accommodate that shift in political preferences. That's a very difficult question. You know, I mean, I think that there are, you know, it's possible that we could distinguish between two types of society. We could distinguish between societies of immigration, like in Western Europe or North America or Australia, and which have kind of immigration policies that encourage and promote immigration from those parts of the world that differ from the majority of society in terms of culture, language, religion. And so the question that I think a lot of countries, or the question that arises in these contexts, is whether these new groups will begin to assert group rights when they kind of attain sufficient numbers. And I think the answer is probably not as much as we think. I think that these claims, often if you look at what claims immigrants make, it's very rarely to kind of create mini societies that replicate their home life. That's not why they left. Most of them left in search of economic opportunity and political freedom. And so what they're looking for is integration on fair terms into economics and into politics. They're not looking to create kind of separate institutions for themselves. I think that in other kinds of countries which are not societies of immigration, where there are long-standing groups who have been present for a long time, I think what you do see is if one set of groups has been acknowledged as being bearers of special political status and other groups are excluded from those arrangements, then questions of fairness arise. And I think that, in a sense, and those claims of fairness are based on good liberal values of non-discrimination and equality. And I think we see that all over the world. Yes, of course. I mean, so what is the downside of recognizing group rights that are rooted and motivated by political and economic concerns? The answer is that it might encourage people to refract their economic and political claims through identity politics and to organize themselves politically on the basis of ethnicity. And it might serve to fragment or divide a polity. And it might discourage the rise of a kind of integrative politics where people interact with each other politically, not as members of ethnic groups, but as citizens who have agreements or disagreements on fundamental questions of economic and social policy. And so I think the answer, so the question is, what do you do with this dilemma where you might have let the genie out of the bottle? And the answer is that, this just might be something you have to live with in a diverse, divided society in which groups have been the victims of discrimination. And you might, what you want to do is build into your politics and into your constitutional system mechanisms to kind of unwind a group-based approach to organizing politics and constitutions and political institutions, so that we can work toward a day when it's not necessary for groups to mobilize on this basis. But I do think that if this is the way it is, you ignore this sort of reality at your peril. And if you don't accommodate these types of claims within politics in the right way, then groups can exit politics and turn to violence. And that's much more dangerous than the alternative. They could exit political life and exit political debate and take their disagreements to the street and turn to violence. And so that's often the choice in these types of contexts. If you don't seek to respond to the ways in which groups mobilize for group rights on the basis of political and economic power, they just might stop talking and settle their disagreements elsewhere. Right. And that's happened. Sri Lanka would be the best example, where in a sense the failure to kind of listen to Tamils and to take their concerns seriously was at the root of the civil war. So the interesting thing about group rights is that how they cash out practically in terms of the design of our political machinery and constitutions varies so much depending on the demography of a particular state. And so a particularly challenging situation might be where there is no dominant majority group and no clear minority, but you have a lot of fragmentation among a lot of different groups. and those differences have served as a basis of political mobilization, and you have political parties organized on that basis. And so I think, where the politics, where the rubber hits the road, where politics is energized, is around questions of electoral system design. How do votes translate into seats in the parliament? Do you use a constituency system? Do you use a system of proportional representation? Do you use a blended system where you might have a multi-member riding that introduces some degree of proportionality into a system that is otherwise still constituency-based? And these debates among systems aren't neutral in their impact on what a legislature looks like and in their impact upon the electoral fortunes of different types of political parties. And I think that in an ethnically fractured society where ethnicity serves as the basis for political mobilization and there are ethnic political parties, it's really there that you see a lot of debate over how votes should be translated into seats. So there's a huge debate among scholars of federalism, and on the question of the relationship between federalism and secession. And the two views are this. One view says that federalism is a stepping stone to secession, because what it does is to basically grant institutional resources and power to a national minority that it will then deploy to mobilize a population to ultimately support secession from the state as a whole. And so the way then to kind of dampen secession is to not have federalism, to have a unitary state. The other view says exactly the opposite. That is, if you have a national minority that's mobilizing along national lines and is making claims for autonomy, federalism, or secession, the way to keep the state together is to give them self-government rights through federalism or some other means. And so this is a kind of a very polarized debate among lawyers and political scientists and politicians, and everyone points to examples, right? So people point to kind of Canada, Spain, the United Kingdom as countries that arguably have been held together because they have become federal. And then on the other hand, there's countries that there's experts who point to Eastern and Central Europe, and how after the fall of the Soviet Union, all the Eastern and Central European federations dissolved, but none of the unitary states broke up. And so the question is, who's right? And it turns out they're both right. It seems that the key ingredient in keeping federations stable and ensuring that federalism does not serve as a stepping stone to secession is democracy. And the reason is that only democratic governments will credibly commit to respecting federal constitutions. Authoritarian states don't commit to respect the law, including a constitution that entrenches a federal constitutional structure. And so where the center can't credibly commit to respecting limits on its authority vis-a-vis a province, then that province might secede. But in a democracy where a government is bound by the rule of law, where there are courts that set limits on a government's power, and where the regions are represented in national institutions, in a lower or an upper chamber of parliament, and at the cabinet table, and in governing political parties, there are all sorts of institutional mechanisms and checks and balances that ensure that the federal bargain is respected.